Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Irwin Mitchell Employment Law webinar this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Sibylle Steiner and I am a partner in the employment team at Irwin Mitchell, and I will be joined this afternoon by my colleagues Kirsty Eyre, who's also a partner, and Laura Willis, a solicitor in the employment team. Before we start, I would just like to make a few housekeeping announcements. We have already received many questions pre-webinar, and thank you very much for sending those. And you can also ask questions during the webinar via the question and answer section on your screen. So please keep sending them in. We will try and deal with them throughout the course of the webinar. It might not be possible to deal with all of them, but you can of course contact us afterwards and we would be very happy to assist. I would also like to add that we are recording this session and a recording will be sent out afterwards as well. Now, today's topic is on employment law, and what we would like to provide you with is an update on the furloughing scheme and also some thoughts on exit strategies for when the furloughing scheme will end. So let's move on. We have prepared some slides, so if we could move on to the first slide, on which you will be able to see a few general points and topics with regard to the furloughing scheme. And what we would like to do is to take you through that, and in particular to provide you with a number of updates. Now, as I think probably we will all have seen, the possibility or the cut-off date for an employee to be able to be put onto the furloughing scheme, that has been moved from the 28th of February 2020 to the 19th of March 2020. However, just to have an employee working on or before that date is not sufficient, because as it's often the case, the devil there is in the detail. So what is relevant, or what has to happen, is that on or before the 19th of March 2020, the employee has to, or the employer has to have sent the real-time information or RTI submission to HMRC with regard to that particular employee. Now, we have seen with a couple of or a few of our clients that people started working before the 19th of March, but that the RTI submission or information has only been sent or was only sent after the 19th of March. And what it looks like at the moment, those employees will not be able to be put on the furloughing scheme. In the latest guidance that we've received from the government, and that came in late on Thursday night last week, you will probably have noticed that the government sends its guidance very late at night or first thing in the morning. Usually it's Fridays or Sundays, but it was on a Thursday last week. And that guidance also provided some further information with regard to the possibility of re-employing staff. Now, what that guidance says is that where an employee was made redundant or stopped working on or after the 28th of February 2020, then the employer can re-employ that employee and put that employee on the furlough scheme from the date of which that applies, even if the re-employment does not take place until after the 19th of March 2020. However, in that scenario, the employee must have been on the payroll, and the RTI submission must have been sent to HMRC as at the 28th of February 2020. So that old date is still relevant in that scenario. Another scenario is where someone was made redundant or stopped working on or after the 19th of March. Now, the reason why this new date is the 19th of March is obviously that was the day before the announcement of the coronavirus retention scheme by the Chancellor. So where someone was made redundant or stopped working after that date, after the 19th of March 2020, that person can be re-employed and put on furlough, but only if that person was employed and the RTI submission had been sent to HMRC on or before the 19th of March 2020. So to try and cut that short, what it means is that basically if an employee is put onto this RTI submission after the 19th of March, then it would not be possible for that employee to be re-employed and to be put on furlough. Now, what this guidance does is gives an employer the option to re-employ an employee. But before, so it's an option, it's not an obligation on the part of the employer to re-employ. And it is our view that that really should be considered very carefully whether an employer does want to take an employee back, because what that means is the employee is back on the books, and the employer will also, I think, at the point before they agree to re-employ, think about what to do with the employee after the furloughing scheme has ended. And our recommendation there is that it clearly needs to be agreed in writing what should happen afterwards, so that everyone, and in particular also the employees, know what to expect and what will happen to their employment after the furloughing scheme has ended. Now, Kirsty, a little bit later, will be dealing with what sort of agreement needs to be made or should be made between the employer and the employee, and we can then talk about whether that letter should, where you have a situation where you re-employ, whether that should then include the conditions on which people are re-employed where they have been made redundant or stopped working beforehand. Now, as a minimum, moving on to what the quick recap, what the furloughing scheme actually does for the employer and the employee. So the employer who has registered the employees for the furloughing scheme, they will receive a grant, and that will cover 80% of the regular wage, or £2,500 per month, and it's the lower of those amounts. So if the 80% is higher than 2,500, only the 2,500 can be recovered from the government. The employer can also ask for associated national insurance contributions and the minimum pension automatic enrolment employer contributions, and those contributions are based on the furlough wage, so not on the normal wage. Discretionary bonus and commission payments can not be included in the calculation of what is regular wage. There is still not entirely clear what exactly that will cover, and we're looking at that a little bit later in the webinar today. Now, it is possible for the employer to top this up, but there is no obligation to do so. We've seen that some of our clients are doing it and other clients are not doing it. The portal opened on the 20th of April, so that was last Monday. And I think what we've heard from our clients is that the experience so far is so good, and that it seems to be relatively easy, and that there haven't been any major of the system. So that is a very clearly a very good thing that that has happened. A few more, I think, general comments with regard to questions that we get regularly on the furloughing scheme before we move on to grey areas. One aspect of furloughing is, and that's been clarified by the government now further as well, that the employee who is on furlough cannot do any work for the employer, with the exception of volunteering and training. Now, in the more recent guidance, the government has confirmed that that also includes the employee being prohibited from doing work for organizations that are linked or associated to the employer company. So, for example, it wouldn't be possible for the employer to be furloughed from one company of a group and then work for another group company while being on furlough. That is not possible. And if that does happen, that employee would not, or the employer would not qualify for getting the money back under the furloughing scheme. We've also had a few questions that we got before the webinar, and those related to the furloughing scheme and public funded organisations, and there has been some recent guidance with regard to that from the government. However, I should add that the situation is still very complex and that we very strongly recommend to take individual and specific advice. To recap, basically the starting point was that the government said, well, where they are public funded organisation, they continue to get the public fund and they should use that to pay the employees and not to furlough them. And that's the advice also that we've been giving our clients who work in those sectors. The new guidance with regard to that seems to be suggesting that it could be possible to furlough staff, for example, that work in functions that are not covered by the public funds. For example, say if there's an organisation with a separate gym which is organised by a separate company, those staff might be able to be furloughed. However, it is extremely complex, and as I said, I think it would go beyond this webinar to give specific advice with regard to that. And I think with this, I would like to move on to the next slide, which deals with some of the grey areas that we are still encountering in relation to the furloughing scheme. Now, the first bullet point there on the slide refers to the direction. Now, that's a Treasury direction, which was published by the government HMRC, and which showed a disparity in quite a few points between the guidance that has been published and keeps getting published and updated on the government website. Now, surprisingly, the government has said that it is its guidance that takes precedence, which is surprising because the direction does have legally binding power, but there we are, that's what the government has been saying, and until they say otherwise, that's what we are left with. So next point is agreement, and Kirsty, you were going to take us through what's required. Is it required in writing? Can one force an employee to be furloughed? What are the important points to bear in mind?
Yes, thank you, Sibylla, and hello everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. So in relation to an agreement, our view is that you are best to get employees to agree to furlough. As an employer, you cannot force an employee onto furlough, because if you did do that, then that would be a breach of their contract of employment, and they could potentially bring claims against you for unlawful deduction from wages in relation to the 20% if you don't top up to 100%, and they could also potentially resign and claim constructive dismissal. Now, in the current climate, I suspect that is unlikely, but it is preferable, I think, to get agreement to furlough. There is some conflict between the direction which the government has issued, or the Chancellor has issued, to HMRC as to how to operate the furlough scheme, and between the guidance that HMRC has issued to employers. What the direction that the HMRC have been given says is that an employee can only be furloughed where the parties have agreed in writing that the employee will cease doing all work for the employer. So that suggests that there has to be some form of agreement from the employee to be furloughed in order for the employer to recover payments under the scheme. The guidance, however, that HMRC have published to employers is slightly different, and what that says is that the employer just has to confirm the furlough arrangements in writing to the employee. And there's also a separate requirement to keep records of the letters that you've sent to the employees about furlough for a 5-year period. We take the view that it is always better to get an employee's consent because you will be making changes to their terms and conditions of employment during the furlough period. You won't be requiring them to come into work, and you will be reducing their pay unless, of course, you are topping up from the 80% to the 100%, but there's no obligation on you to do that. Some people have suggested that if you sent employees on furlough already and haven't got consent from them, then you can try and obtain consent after the event by writing to them and asking them to confirm their agreement. I don't think you need actually a wet signature on the furlough letter. I think it's sufficient for you to write to the employee setting out the terms of the furlough and asking them to confirm their agreement by way of an email to you, and then you keep a copy of that email along with the original letter. If employees are not even going to be able to do that, then what you could do is say, we will assume that unless we hear from you by X date, you agree to be furloughed. So you're trying to get some form of a deemed consent. But it's far better to try and get employees' agreement up front to this and then just confirm it in writing and ask them to agree to what's been set out in writing. I don't know if, Sibylla, you've come across any employees objecting to being furloughed or refusing to be furloughed. I certainly haven't with the clients that I've been working with.
Actually, I have. Yes, I have come across that situation where, in particular, the employees are saying that they have been unfairly selected to be put on furlough. So that, and also saying that there were discriminatory reasons why they have been put on furlough, or because they had raised grievances or concerns previously. So those objections, I think, related, well, in the cases that I've come across, related to the selection. So where there is a group of employees and only one part of the group was going to be put on furlough, and that's where the objections sort of came from and resulted from.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, because the clients that I've been working with, it's been more people have been wanting to be furloughed rather than objecting to it. One additional benefit of getting agreement in writing is that there may be additional provisions that you want to impose during the furlough leave period, which which aren't currently in their contracts of employment, or you may wish to vary them. So, for example, there is nothing to stop an employee on furlough working for another employer or volunteering for another employer whilst they are on furlough. If there is a clause in their contract of employment which says that they have to devote all of their working hours to you and that they can't work for any other employer whilst they're employed by you, then you may wish to vary that in the furlough scheme. You may wish to set out in the letter what it is they can and cannot do whilst they are furloughed. For example, one of the things that you can ask employees to do whilst on furlough is training, which is relevant to their jobs with you. So if you're expecting employees to do training, then you might wish to set that out in the furlough letter. Now, whilst we're on the subject of agreement, I'm just looking at a couple of questions that have come in which are relevant. And one of the questions that somebody's asked is whether employment terms and conditions can be changed following a return to work after furlough. Well, the simple answer to that is that yes, they can be. You can vary terms and conditions at any time, but only with the agreement of the employee. And in order to get that agreement, you will need to carry out some form of a consultation with them to talk about the changes that you are proposing, the reasons for them, and hopefully the benefits for them in signing up. Is there anything that you wanted to add in relation to agreement, Sibylla, that you've come across, or shall we move on now and talk about pay and what is taken into account?
Yes, I think let's move on. Let's move on to pay.
Okay, so again, this is an area where we are advising on the basis of government guidance and direction rather than black letter law. So the answers aren't always 100% certain. What the direction says is that you should pay average monthly pay when it comes. So when you're submitting claims, you look at the average monthly pay of employees. So for those who are on a fixed salary, then that will be fairly obvious what you pay them every month. Where it becomes more of a challenge is if you would normally pay things such as commission or overtime. And the guidance that has now been issued to HMRC does contain some details, and if you are submitting a claim on the portal, then I would suggest that you check that. And for those of you that are interested, it's set out in paragraph 7 of the government direction. And it refers to regular salary or wages. Now, before the direction was issued, it was thought, based upon the interpretation of HMRC guidance, that you could include matters such as contractual commission payments and contractual overtime payments. If they varied from month to month, you would average out over the last 12 months, or you could look at what they earned in the calendar year prior to, in the calendar in 12 months prior to the scheme coming into force. What is clear that because the direction has changed slightly, and it says that regular salary does not include payments which vary according to either the performance of the employee or the performance of the business. So that suggests that commission type payments may not be recoverable under the scheme. Payments which are conditional or discretionary will definitely not be included, so we're only talking about contractual payments. I think from a practical perspective, because we are operating in a little bit of a void here, what I would suggest is that you when you are submitting your claims using the portal, you include all of the regular contractual payments, such as commission that you would pay and contractual overtime, because if you don't include it, then there's no chance of recovering it. But if you do include it, then it may well be that your employees or that you can recover 80% of it under the furlough scheme. So that's my advice in relation to pay, which is more, I think, more of a pragmatic one than anything else. I'm just looking as to some of the questions that have come up in relation to pay. Laura, have you got any questions that you think I've not answered on pay that I could answer?
No, I think we're pretty much done on pay.
Brilliant. Okay. So, Bill, are we going to talk about the very popular question of holiday now, and can employees take holiday on furlough? Can you force them to take holiday whilst on furlough?
Well, the answer to the first question is yes. So we finally had some guidance from the government with regard to that. So we now know that it is possible that an employee can take holiday during the furloughing period. Now, what we don't know exactly yet is whether it is possible for an employer to ask employees, for example, take all the holidays during furlough. Now, that might be attractive for an organization, for business, because it would first mean that the employees take the holidays now while there isn't anything to do anyway, and then won't take holidays and will be back ready to work when the situation changes and the business can start working back to normal levels again. Now, in principle, I think we can say that it's possible under the working time regulation for an employer to ask an employee to take a holiday if they take into account the proper notice that they have to give. The notice that needs to be given, unless it's dealt with otherwise in an employment contract or policy, is twice as long as the holiday that the employer wants the employee to take. So, say if an employer wants an employee to take 5 days holiday, then the employer has to give 10 days notice. If it's 2 days holidays, it's 4 days notice, and so on. Sometimes employment contracts or policies provide for a shorter period, and if asking employees to take holidays during furloughing is something that you would like to consider, we very strongly recommend that you have a look at your contracts and policies to see what that allows you to do and what sort of notice you can or you've got to give. I think, as I said at the beginning, there are some very clever employment law brains who are still, or people with very clever employment law brains, who are arguing whether it is possible, despite what I've just explained, the notice that has to be given and so on, to ask the employees to take a large chunk, or, as I said, all holidays that they have during the furloughing period. And I think unless that situation is clarified, our advice would be to be careful asking employees to do that. The next question then is what needs to be paid during the holiday pay, and there the advice that we're giving is that it should be the normal pay. So if you have employees, say, who are on furlough at the moment, we've got the bank holidays coming up. So the first one next Monday, 1st May bank holiday. What should be done with regard to that is that the pay, if they are on topped up 100% pay in furlough anyway, it's not relevant, but if the employees or an employee is on the 80% pay, then for those holidays, that should be topped up to the 100%. If a business does not want to do that, what can be done with regard to bank holidays or holidays that are already pre-booked, for example? It should then be ideally agreed between the employer and the employee that those holidays should be cancelled, and that they can then be taken at a later point. And Kirsty talked about the furloughing agreement a bit earlier, and that is, for example, something that we advise our clients would be a good point to cover in that agreement as to what should be happening with regard to holidays. Laura, do we have any further questions on holidays which we should cover?
No, I think that pretty much covers holiday.
Okay. Great. Then the next point is redundancy. Now we're going to deal with the topic of redundancy on the next slide as well when we talk about exit strategies. But we wanted to cover that here as well because we've received a few questions. First of all, is it possible to make an employee redundant while on furlough or after furlough? And then also, how is the pay that the employee is then going to receive, how is that going to be calculated? So looking again at the guidance and what the government has says, it seems to be possible to make an employee redundant while on furlough or after furlough. Now that should then also mean that it should be possible to consult with an employee, or if there's a collective consultation, to consult collectively during the furloughing period. However, there is a question mark, and again we'll look into that in a little bit more detail later as to whether that might amount to work, which is obviously not allowed while on furlough or not. Now, how does one calculate the statutory redundancy pay for someone who is on furlough? Now, normally that's calculated based on a week's pay. That's easy for someone who has normal working hours and regular pay. Based on that, and the week's pay there is calculated on what's payable under the employment contract on the calculation day. With regard to an employee who doesn't have normal working hours, the week's pay is calculated based on an average weekly pay of 12 weeks. And what we're talking about now here is the weekly pay that we need when it comes to calculating a statutory redundancy payment. And an employee is entitled to a statutory redundancy payment if they have 2 or more years of service. So what happens now if the employee is on the reduced furloughing pay? So what does one use, the reduced furloughing pay, or does one use the normal pay? I think, as the heading on the slide says, that is still a grey area. There is some thought that with regard to employees who are on normal pay, one should probably use the pre-furlough pay, so the pay they had before they got furloughed. However, where the employee is on variable pay, and where one look at the average over the last 12 weeks, probably with regard to that, the reduced furloughing pay is likely to come into that, sort of looking back the 12 weeks, and the longer the furloughing period takes, the more the reduced pay is likely to come into that calculation. Another grey area is what notice pay has to be paid if someone's employment is terminated during the furloughing period. The safest option clearly is to pay the normal pay, but there is a question mark whether it would be possible just to pay the reduced furloughed pay. What one needs to look at is, first of all, what the employment contract provides. There are some slightly weird technical legal provisions which might result in a different view, and I think our advice on this webinar today is that if you have that situation, take legal advice with regard to that individual employee, and then decide what notice pay you as a business decide to pay. I don't know, Kirsty, whether you have any further thoughts on that, and if not, shall we move on to sick pay and whether an employee can be furloughed whilst off sick, shielding, and so on?
Yes, let me do that. But before I do, I just want to cover off a couple of questions which have come in on the live chat. And one of those questions is, how much notice do we have to give to extend furlough leave beyond the original period stated when we first wrote to staff to seek their agreement to furlough? Well, the simple answer to that is that there is no minimum period required under the scheme. So it's really a practical question rather than a legal question, and it will depend partly as well upon what you've put in your original furlough letter. So if in your original furlough letter you made it clear that the furlough period was for, let's say, three weeks being the minimum, was for a 3-week period, and there was no reference to it being extended, then you would need to try and get agreement to extend it, and just allow time for you to communicate with employees, bearing in mind that you may have cut off their work email addresses. They may not be responding as quickly as possible because they may be trying to homeschool children or look after children during the furlough period. If in your original furlough letter you stated that the furlough leave could be extended by you writing to them, then you've put yourself in a good position. But it's more a question of practicalities, I think, that question, rather than a strictly a legal answer. Also, another question. Oh yes, one of the other questions that's come in is about training for job-related matters. Do people need to be paid separately if they are required to train whilst on furlough? The simple answer is no, unless they are paid below national minimum wage. So if the 80% takes them below national minimum wage, then you must top that up to the 100% to make sure that they are at least getting national minimum wage during the periods that they're training for you. So moving on now to sick pay. Can an employee be furloughed whilst off sick? Well, again, I wish there was a simple yes or no answer that I could give you, but there is conflicting a conflict again between the direction to HMRC and the guidance which HMRC have published. So the direction says that if an employee is getting SSP or qualifies for SSP, then furlough cannot start until the end of the SSP period, which suggests that if employees are unwell and qualify for SSP, that you cannot furlough them. So that's what the direction says. What does the actual guidance to employees say that's been published by HMRC itself? Well, that says something slightly different. That says that short-term sickness and self-isolation should not be a consideration in deciding whether to furlough an employee. But if you as a business, as an employer, want to furlough for business reasons, you can furlough people who are currently off sick, in which case they would come off sick pay and go on to furlough. So again, we've got some conflicting views there. What's the pragmatic solution to this? Well, I guess if you were to take somebody off sick pay and put them onto furlough, and HMRC were then subsequently to turn around and say, well, no, we're following the direction which says that whilst they qualify for SSP, you can't furlough them, then you as an employer could be liable for paying the difference between what they would have had whilst they were off sick and the 80% that they would have got under the furlough scheme. If they are on full pay, so if you're an employer that pays full pay for the first few weeks or months of sickness and they are still within that period, then your risk, your financial risk, is low, because you would try and get their agreement to go on to 80%, and if they were to agree to be furloughed and it subsequently turned out that they weren't entitled, that you can't recover the money, then you would still end up paying the 80%, which would be less than the 100% sick pay that they may have got from you, if your sick pay policy provides for 100%. So there is an unanswered question around furloughing sick employees. There is another unanswered question around what happens if somebody who is furloughed becomes unwell. Now, I suspect that the practicality of it is that if somebody has the odd day off and when they're not feeling well, they may not let you know unless you've put in place an obligation or made it clear that the existing sickness reporting procedures still apply. So if you don't know about it, then I wouldn't be really concerned about it. And CIPD have suggested that if an employee does become unwell whilst they are off sick, so whilst they are furloughed, then you have the choice as to whether to keep them on furlough or bring them back off furlough and put them onto sick pay. Laura, have we got any questions surrounding sick pay? Aha, I've just seen one.
Yeah, I had one pop in.
What if they become sick while on furlough, i.e. when you ask them to come back to work? Yes, a strategic sickness absence. I had this recently with a client where people didn't want to come back off furlough and were coming up with various reasons as to why not to. If they become unwell at the end of the furlough period, to the extent that they can't come back from furlough, then you would just deal with that as you would any other sickness absence, using your normal sickness absence reporting procedures. There would be no automatic extension of the furlough period because they were unwell. They would effectively come back off furlough and then go on to sick leave.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. That was very informative. And I suggest we move on to the next slide now, which deals with the exit from the furlough scheme. Now, the furloughing scheme has been extended until the 30th of June 2020, but we very strongly recommend and are advising our clients with regard to any plans that the business has coming out of the furloughing period. And Kirsty, we've got a few points listed there on our slides. Do you want to start taking us through that?
I will.
Business has.
Yes, and I think, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown and the introduction of the coronavirus job retention scheme, the immediate focus of many HR teams was just on how do we survive the next few weeks, and let's furlough staff to try and reduce costs, take costs out of the business. Now my experience is that people are looking to the future and how can we get staff back to work? What do we do? So there's a number of possibilities. If your organisation is in the fortunate position that you are likely to have an ongoing need for the same or very similar numbers of staff after the end of June this year, then it's a return to business as normal, and you bring employees back off furlough and back to work on their previous terms and conditions. And that, I suspect, would be the ideal solution for most of us, but may not be the reality for many organisations who may have an ongoing need to reduce payroll costs. And you can do that in a couple of ways. Obviously, there's the redundancy option, which I will come on to look at it shortly. But if you wish to try and avoid redundancies, then there are a number of options that you could consider, all of which will need the employee's agreement because they amount to a change to employees' terms and conditions of employment. So the first option set out on the slide is extending the existing furlough, but in the knowledge that you as an employer will be paying 80%, assuming that you're not topping up at the moment, 80% of salary, but without getting the money back from the government. Benefits of that is you take 20% off your normal payroll costs, but the downside of that is that you don't get any work from your employees. So I suspect that for most employers that will not be an attractive option, save on a very, very short-term basis. So that's one option you can look at. Another option that you can look at is agreeing a longer term reduction in working hours and pay with your employees. Linked to that is a third option, which I guess would be the ideal solution for many employers, but not so ideal for the employees, which is that employees come back to work on reduced pay, but working the same hours. Now, all of these options, as I've said, you will need agreement to, because they will amount to variations to the contract of employment. I think we're all going to have to think creatively in the weeks and months ahead to come up with solutions. You could look at alternatives such as unpaid sabbaticals, asking people to take unpaid periods of leave or part paid leave, encouraging people, for example, to make the most of, or to use parental leave when they are entitled to it, or use up their holiday, or just take unpaid leave or sabbaticals. Those are solutions to try and avoid head count losses, and I'm sure there'll be others in the audience who've come up with more or with other alternatives as well. Your last case scenario, your worst case scenario for most employers will be redundancies and reducing headcount. We're hearing already of a lot of businesses who have got recruitment freezes on, who are withdrawing job offers and deferring start dates for staff that were due to be joining them for periods of 6 months or more, until we know better what the economic climate is. Again, if you want to withdraw an offer that has been accepted or to delay a start date, you will in theory need an employee's or your future employee's consent to that if you've got a legally binding contract of employment in place already, so that you've actually had an offer and acceptance and you've agreed a start date. So in terms of making redundancies, the starting point is to think about, well, how many people do we need to lose? If your numbers stack up to 20 or more, within any one establishment, and there's quite a lot of case law around what amounts to an establishment. Very often it will be a particular office or a branch, but where people move around, where you've got a peripatetic workforce, or you have offices close together which are managed together, then they could amount to an establishment. So the first stage is to identify whether each of your different offices or the places where you'll be making redundancies amounts to a separate establishment or not, because you then have to count the number of people that you are proposing to lose within that establishment. And if it gets to 20 or more within a 90-day period, then you are looking at carrying out collective redundancy consultation. And that will have to take place with unions if you recognise unions, and if you don't recognise unions, then you can look at any other existing staff consultation bodies you have, or you may have to build in time for employees to elect representatives. In addition to carrying out the collective consultation, you also will have to consider individual consultation to reduce your risk of unfair dismissal claims. Just a couple of other points to consider in relation to redundancies. Firstly, if you are if the duty to carry out collective consultation is triggered, you will need to file an HR1 with BAYS as well. An important one to remember, because there are criminal penalties and sanctions for not complying with that obligation, and none of us want to be responsible for our directors having criminal charges made against them. And then the other issue to consider is when you carry out the consultation, as Sibylla referred to earlier, and whether you can actually start consultation whilst an employee is being furloughed. I think it's about assessing overall risk, because if an employee is required to go through consultation processes or to attend consultation meetings whilst they are on furlough, then whilst they're not generating revenue for your business or providing services for you, they are really working, because I don't think any of us would choose to attend redundancy consultation meetings in our own time. It may be that we get some guidance down the line from HMRC or from the Secretary of State as to whether redundancy consultation can be carried out. But if there's anything more than, but if you are carrying it out while somebody is furloughed, then there is a risk that that will amount to work and jeopardise the payments under the job retention scheme. Sibylla, is there anything that you wanted to add in relation to furlough exit plans or redundancies generally?
Yeah, thank you, Kirsty. I think just to add on the point whether taking part in a consultation would regard to work or not, I think one can only hope that some sort of common sense approach will be taken, because it does say in the guidance that it is possible to make people redundant while on furlough, so it should really also be possible then for an employer to take the correct steps and to comply with the consultation obligations that the employer has. And coming back to the collective consultation, if that obligation is not complied with, that has potentially some very some hefty financial implications, because employees could be entitled to receive what's called the protective award, and it can be up to 90 days full pay. So that is potentially quite costly for an employer if they don't go through that collective consultation period. And I think that also needs to be borne in mind when to consider and when to weigh up whether to conduct a collective consultation during the furloughing period. And staying with the topic of collective consultation, Kirsty, you mentioned earlier the possibilities of reducing costs by changing the contract, changing the hours, reducing pay, and so on. And there is also there potentially the necessity to go through a collective consultation if that affects 20 or more employees.
Thank you, Sibylla. We've got about 5 minutes now left, so shall we just run through any outstanding questions that we have? Laura, do you want to take us through those?
Yeah, so we've got quite a few on coming out of furlough. One of which is, can employees come in and out of furlough, provided the periods are 3 weeks at a time? And how do we end furlough? Do we have to give any period of notice?
Thank you. Shall I?
Okay. Okay. Well, I got there first. Yes, it is possible to rotate people in and out, and we also see that with quite a few of our clients who rotate team members in and out, so that the furloughing is actually is everybody has a sort of period on furlough, and that I think also relates back to what we discussed earlier, to reduce the risks of people who have been put on furlough, saying that that was an unfair selection. So the rotation in and out is possible. And what was the second part of the question again?
Do we have to give any kind of notice to terminate furlough, or do it in writing?
Okay, I again, there is no guidance with regard to that. Our recommendation is to provide, I would say, a day or 48 hours notice. I think we would also recommend to do it in writing so that it is there in black and white. But in any event, I think what employers are probably doing anyway is to stay in contact with their employees. And yes, employees are on furlough, can't work. We've discussed that quite a lot this afternoon. But I think when it comes to ending furloughing and so on, there should be communication from the employer to sort of warn that the furloughing period is coming to an end. What other questions do we have? Thank you, Laura.
We have another one about changing hours. So if an employee's hours were to change during the furlough period, should their pay be adjusted to the new hours, or should they be paid at the pre-furlough hours for the period of furlough?
I'm happy to take that one.
Yeah, give that to Kirsty.
Thanks. My view is that you would keep them on the simplest thing to do is just to keep them on the pre-furlough hours. So you look at the pay that they received before they began on the furlough scheme, and that's what the 80% is calculated on. So what it might mean in practice is that you are then delaying the implementation of the change in hours until they actually come back from the furlough period. I see that we've just had a question in about a question about redundancy. Somebody has asked, can I make people redundant if they've only been with us for 3 months before they are put on furlough? Simple answer is absolutely yes, you can. Somebody who's only been with you for 3 months doesn't have the right to bring an ordinary claim of unfair dismissal arising out of the redundancy, or to a statutory redundancy payment. So your legal risk in making people with such short periods of time redundant is low. Just be aware, however, that they will count when you're doing the totting up to work out if you get to the 20 that triggers collective consultation and the requirement to file an HR1. Those dismissals will count towards that 20.
Any other questions, Laura?
We've got one about holiday. So with regard to enforced holidays, that would be a holiday we force an employee to take it. Does that apply to holidays whilst accrued on furlough only, or does it apply to annual leave in total?
I think the question that, or let's turn that round. Where employers are considering to enforcing holidays, that if you had an employee in the normal holiday year, not beginning or end, that would, I think, apply to the whole of the holidays, which the employer then would like the employee to take during the furloughing period. But whether it is possible to do that and to sort of push all of that into the furloughing period, that's where there is still a question mark. Any other questions?
There is just one about the mechanics of claiming. So if a claim has already been submitted for some staff in April for the April period, can they submit another claim for additional staff for that period?
I think, I must admit, I don't know the answer to that. Kirsty, do you?
I don't think it's clear from the actual guidance, but what I have heard anecdotally is that employers are being told only one claim can be made a month, but that's just anecdotal, so it may be worthwhile asking that question to HMRC to get their view for a response on that. I don't think it's covered.
Yeah, but it should then be possible to make the claim for that second group of employees then the next month, so it would just be delayed or not rather than lost.
I think that's it for questions, and we have published in the Q&A the feedback form.
Yes, so thank you very much for joining us at our webinar this afternoon. In the Q&A there is a link to the feedback form, so we would be very grateful if you could fill that in, and also if there are topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars, again we would really be very pleased to hear from you with regard to those. Last but not least, if I could just point you to some more information that we have on our website, and also the coronavirus updates in our coronavirus hub. The updates are still coming in fast, and if you want to know what the latest position is, we try to put information in there as soon as we possibly can, so please have a look at that and sign up for that. And then again, thank you very much to Kirsty and Laura for helping with the webinar and answering the questions today, and thank you very much for joining us again, and hopefully we will see you again soon at another webinar. Thank you very much.